seconds to make sure we're all good. And cool. Alrighty. Okay, so Dark Bleatings, everyone. I am here with an author interview today. As you can see, I have Sean Hogan with me, who a lot of you might be familiar with for various reasons, including this absolute beast, and England Screaming, and most recently, The Corpse Road, that you may have seen me banging on and on and on about for the last couple of months because I loved it. So welcome, Sean. Thanks for doing this.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So may as well start with The Corpse Road since I'm obsessed with it currently. Would you like to tell people a little bit about this book? Spoiler free, of course.
Yes. It is a how best to put it? It's I suppose it's sort of a gothic suspense thriller narrated by two sisters who are both probably in their own ways somewhat unreliable. And it tells the story of their sort of dysfunctional relationship and what happens to them after sort of mutual tragedy strikes, and the story of this old cottage that they both own in Cornwall, which is surrounded by a legend haunted forest. And gradually, as the novel progresses, it's sort of things get weirder and stranger and darker, and it's sort of by the end, I think, sort of shades into, you know, fully fledged folk horror. So yeah, it's something that's been living in my head for quite a while now, so I've almost kind of forgotten how best to talk about it.
Well, I'm really glad that you unleashed it on the rest of us because PS Publishing actually sent me the ebook for review, but then I was at FantasyCon and I was at your book launch. So I was like, oh, well, I may as well pick up a physical copy while I'm here and I can get it signed. And I absolutely loved it. I think I read it in one sitting, which that is not the norm for me with a novel. I normally do not have enough time to read a novel in one sitting, but presumably I just sort of binned off all of my other priorities for that day to make way. But
I'm very glad to hear it.
It was so compelling, and so our two characters are Annie and Ruth, and the way that you wrote it is so we alternate chapters between Annie and Ruth, sort of like telling us what's going on, and that's one of my favorite storytelling modes to be in. And I think it made it really Moorish because you'd get to the end of an Annie section and then you'd think, oh, I need to know what she's going to say next, and then you get a Ruth one, and it was like a repeating thing. Sorry, my cat's just noisily stomped in here.
It's all right. Mine might make an entrance at some point as well, so don't worry.
He always turns up if my attention isn't on him. So, and I thought that the thing that you did so well is their relationship just seems from the off a bit fraught. Like they're very different people, and I think that people, especially these days, are so quick to say, oh, that's a toxic relationship, what if you like go no contact, and going no contact because you've got a difficult relationship with a relative is not, it's not like a wishy-washy thing. Most people can't just snap their fingers and go, oh, I don't care about this person anymore. And so I thought that you painted it so well. It was like so understandable why they were still in each other's lives because they love each other.
Yeah, I mean, not all right. This is not necessarily true for everyone, but a lot of us do have difficult family relationships. You know, I've had them, not with any of my siblings, I hasten to add, but I've certainly had difficult relationships with other members of my family. And yeah, it's sort of like it's not that easy just to banish them from your life, and you know, there are all sorts of things tying you together, and it can be incredibly infuriating and difficult, and there are all these emotions tied up in those relationships, but yeah, you can't just walk away from it.
I thought that it was really emotionally honest, because both of these characters are, they feel very real, so they're flawed people, not necessarily bad.
Yeah.
Especially for like most of the book. But people that make questionable decisions, or their outlook differs from your outlook. And the thing that I think one of my other favorite, I had lots of favorite things about this book show, but one of my other favorite things was, because we're swapping perspectives, we're actually getting quite a detailed glimpse into perspective and how different that is depending on who you are in a situation, because nobody thinks that they're the problem in a relationship. And yeah, I don't want to say which, but I did, have a favorite sister that I sort of like empathized a bit more with um, for a while. And yeah, so I think I wrote in my written review that even if this wasn't a horror story and this was just a story about two sisters going through a patch of their relationship, and it was more like a drama, I still would have loved the book. But the horror elements that you sort of like work in through the story really elevated it to a great horror story as well.
Oh, brilliant. I'm very glad. Yeah, I mean, we've all had, well, again, I say we all, not necessarily all of us, but I've certainly been in positions where, I know two people who are, whether they're two people in a relationship or whatever, and maybe you sort of know one person better than the other, and you hear their side of things, and you sort of think, oh yeah, well, I sympathize with you, etc., etc., and then you find out that there's a whole other side to it, and you sort of think, oh, everything I thought all along was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And the book tries to sort of play that kind of game, I guess. It's you might think one thing about one sister, but then as the story goes on, maybe things start to get a bit more complicated. And yeah, as I like flawed characters, I find
Oh,
them much
yeah.
more interesting to write. I know that not everyone likes that. Some people like things to be a bit more clear cut,
Mm-hmm.
but I've always sort of written kind of ambiguous, flawed characters. I remember I made a film a couple of years ago. We had a screening of it last year, and one of the questions was, something to do with all my characters being bad people. And I was like, well, I don't think they're all necessarily bad people. I think they all have their flaws, and some are badder than others. But those are the kind of characters I like to write.
Well, they're certainly way more interesting to read than people who are just objectively good people that don't seem to make any mistakes. And I think I've noticed with review, not of this book specifically, but especially of TV and film and stuff, a lot of people are revisiting shows that came out 25 years ago and going, oh God, all these characters are terrible people.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm like, are they? Or have they just been well written as realistically flawed people that
Yes.
sometimes they can be a bit of a dick, but
Yeah. And who said, I've never signed up to this idea that characters all have to be sort of, morally above reproach. They have to be good people. I'm much more interested in conflicted, flawed characters. And when I grew up and I started getting into books and films, that was more commonplace. A lot of the stuff I grew up loving was about people who were not easy to like. And so that's just kind of what I always wanted to do. And now we're in an age where a lot of people seem to like things being a little less complicated, but that's not kind of how I roll.
No, I mean, I always prefer the stories where there are moments where I feel disappointed in the protagonist, but I understand why they made a decision. I think as viewers and readers, I think there is a bit of a tendency to be a bit more judgmental, hypocritically judgmental, is what I think, because none of us are, infallible. I think
Sure, yeah.
everyone has at least said things that they wish they hadn't said now in hindsight or whatever, or you said something stupid, or maybe you held a view at some point that you no longer hold. And like Yeah, I think the critique of flawed characters or characters that even make bad decisions that you wouldn't make, I think that the critique is a bit I know, do as I say, not as I do kind of
Yeah,
judgment.
no, totally. And also this idea, which seems to be like increasingly prevalent as well, is that if the characters say or do one thing, something bad or abhorrent, that somehow reflects on the author. And it's sort of
Oh,
like, no, yeah, it's there's
yeah,
a really big difference between what I think and say and do and what my characters think and say and do.
yeah.
And one is not reflective of the other, but that seems to be a weird mindset that's kind of crept in around the edges recently.
Yeah, I see. Whenever I read a book that I love, I always go and look at book reviews like immediately after, so I can find other people that loved it, and then I can talk about the book. And I quite often see reviews where people, and like, everyone's reviews are valid and stuff, but I just feel like sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect in like the comprehension between like author and prose, because I see oh I try not to bring him up in everything I do, but Stephen King gets criticized for this quite a lot. Where like recently, like newer readers are like picking up on like racist language, and I'm like, but it's language the characters are like
Yeah.
he's not painting those characters out as our heroes necessarily. They're he's just kind of being honest about how people talk.
Oh, exactly. Yeah,
It's
yeah. And
uncomfortable.
now it's people are so frightened to do that kind of thing now. I mean, I've written some stuff certainly in like the screaming books that are about like openly racist characters that you sort of
Mhm.
get into some, you know,
Yeah.
uneasy territory with them. But it's sort of like, what's the alternative to be dishonest about how these people talk? And, because then you're not reflecting anything real. You're just
Yeah.
whitewashing real life. And it's like, I don't think that's helpful either. It's better to confront this stuff head on.
Well, I think we as a society we learn a lot about what's reflected in the creative arts, and a lot of universities will have books on the syllabus that they're studying because it uh is a good example of the social climate of the time with like language and prejudices and things. So I don't think it helps to just completely remove it from book, like out of fear that you're going to get accused of, as long as you're not painting out a white supremacist as the hero of your story.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe this guy had a point, like you're probably going to be quite fairly criticized then, but yeah, I think it's I think that's what I really loved about these characters, is that they just really felt like very real people, and I had more patience for one than the other, but sympathy for both. And I was very interested in both of them as well, because even the one that I liked less, I couldn't wait to get to her chapters, because I was like, well, what's going on? What's she going to do now?
Well, yeah, that's the thing. It's like ultimately, it's for me, it's not about a character being sympathetic. It's, are they interesting?
Mhm,
That's what I'm strive towards, is like interesting characters. I couldn't really give a damn if they're sympathetic or not. I just
mhm.
hope they're interesting.
Yeah, I thought it just. I think another thing that sorry, I'm going to start so many sentences with another thing I loved about the book, but the the idea that the unreliable narrator thing. So I do like that, but I like it even more if I'm not sure if the narrator is unreliable. Like I don't trust myself to know if I like. So I trusted one more than the other. But then I was like, wow, but these women are experiencing similar things, and they're talking about it so differently, that I was like, oh, I'm gonna have to make a bit of room in my mind for, maybe I'm not getting like a whole truth out of either of them.
Because we
um,
all process things differently, and we all
mm,
look at the world differently. So people have very different viewpoints on things, and who's to say who's right and who's wrong?
mhm. It is about perspective more than like right or wrong, like, because I mean, there are people's truths, and then there is the truth of the thing that actually happened, but however you've experienced a thing is how you're going to remember it and feel about it. I've had disagreements with people about conversations from times past where one person is swearing down that they told me something, and I'm like, you did not tell me, like, and I'm like, well, one of us is wrong, and I don't think it's me, but they don't think it's them, so I don't know.
But you know, it's like scientific studies have proven that human memory is amazingly fallible. So it's sort of like, who can even really say what the truth of something is? You know, once it's firmly in the past, it's up for grabs, man.
I read a paper about that just recently, that you know, you think you can trust your own memory because sometimes you really clearly remember things, and then as it turns out, that's just not exactly what happened, or your brain has filled things in that weren't there. And I was questioning everything I've ever thought. I was like, oh God, did I have that experience that time? Or
Yeah.
I don't think you have to go that far with it, but yeah, human memory is very interesting, and human perspective is really interesting, and especially familial relationships that aren't all roses are very interesting to read about. So the actual horror elements, I don't want to. Well, you have a range actually, because they have a shared horrible experience, and that in itself is just the stuff of nightmares for real. And then you have a more folky horror elements, and I, even though I was at your book launch and you explained about the book a bit, for some reason I forgot. So when we started getting to things, I was like really shocked, but like in a good way, like in a delighted way, because I was like, well, this is a horror novel, and I'm wondering where it's going to go now. And then the place that you took it was so um surprising and dark, and even for a story like this, it was so dark. I appreciated that, Sean.
I'm good. I'm very glad you did. It's funny, because I wrote this. Well, this is a story that's been in my head for a long time, because I originally wrote it as a screenplay about 10 years ago, and then I eventually decided to turn it into a novel after I wrote England Screaming. I kind of thought, oh, I'm gonna, because England Screaming is kind of its own beast, and it's a sort of, I do consider it a novel, but it's sort of a mosaic novel.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, no, I'm going to have a crack at writing an actual novel. And I thought about this story, which had never quite left my head. And I thought, oh, I know just how to do that as a novel. And I wrote it during lockdown, so it's kind of been sat there for a little while now. And I hadn't actually looked at it for quite some time when PS agreed to publish it. So I was like, oh, I'll pick this up again and I better have another look at this, because I haven't looked at it for a couple of years. And when I started like going through it and proofing it, I was like, oh my God, this is dark. I was like, this is darker than I remember it being. I was like, who's going to want to read this book? It's just bleak and depressing.
Yeah, I did. So for people who missed my best of 2024 lists, like this was in my top 10 novels of the year, and not just novels that were published last year, but anything I read last year was like eligible to be in my little list. And I loved this, and I just couldn't stop talking about it once I'd read it, and it's really stayed with me, like the feeling I had. It's so atmospheric, and I love the main setting of this cabin that they co-own. I really loved that, and like the area, and because initially we don't really go outside the cabin, and then we get a little bit outside of it after. And it was when they went out that I was like, I have a bad feeling for this whole place. Do you, as someone who like reads and watches things, is folk horror sort of a particular interest of yours, or is this just where you felt this story belonged?
Well, like I say, I actually wrote this story, although as I say, it started as a screenplay, but I wrote it before the whole folk horror thing kind of exploded.
Mhm.
So it was not a phrase anyone was really using when I first wrote the original screenplay.
Mhm.
What happened was is I sort of stumbled across the whole mythology and folklore surrounding corpse roads,
Mhm.
and I was like, oh wow, this is really interesting stuff, and I can't believe no one's ever utilized this, and that's kind of where it began, and it sort of went in many different directions, and that's more kind of a bit of a backdrop to the novel now. It's not as focused on that folklore,
Mhm.
um, but that was where it started, and yeah, folk horror wasn't a thing then.
Mhm.
So by the time I actually, sat down to turn it into a novel, I was like, oh well, I guess this kind of is folk horror, but that's not how it was originally imagined, because that was just
Mhm.
not a thing. So it's in that sense, it's just, yeah, it's tying into stuff that I already loved anyway. I mean, a lot of the kind of classic folk horror that people reference now is stuff I grew up loving,
Mhm.
whether it's like stuff from like 70s TV, or like the classic sort of trinity of Wicker Man and Blood on Satan's Claw and Which One in General. This was all stuff I grew up watching.
Mhm.
Um, and so yes, it's probably seeped in. It's part of my kind of creative DNA, but I just didn't originally think of it in those terms. That was more of, oh, I guess it's a folk horror story. So yeah.
I
And
think.
then in the novel I sort of leaned into that,
Mhm.
because weaving in all of the other sort of stories, the folkloric
Mhm.
stories that kind of are interspersed throughout the book, some of which are based on real kind of myths and some of which are made
Mhm.
up. But I kind of thought, oh well, I can utilize this more in the novel because there's room to do it. So
Mhm.
yeah, it was sort of fun leading into those aspects.
Well, that's really interesting, actually, because obviously, when I read this, I didn't know when you wrote it or when you first conceived of it. But it's one of the I love folk horror. That is one of my favorite subgenres of the moment, and I've been watching and reading all of the folk horror that I can find. And this is one of the more unique takes on that subgenre for me. This and That Which Stands Outside by Mark Morris, the two most original folk horror stories I've read in the last year for sure. Because, and I say this with the greatest of respect to folk horror, and again, absolutely love it, but there tends to be typical markers in folk horror stories where you know exactly what kind of story you're in straight off the bat. And a lot of them revolve around cults, or like a whole village has this big secret and they're all complicit in it. And stuff like that. And I love all of that stuff, but this felt um, there's obviously folk horror, but it just felt more personal,
Yeah.
like localized, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I didn't worry that, you know. Oh, I don't say worry. I wouldn't have like, disliked this, but I didn't think that all of a sudden 50 robed figures were going to emerge from the trees or anything like that. It was very much its own thing. I'd never heard of corpse roads before. I googled after because I was like, oh my gosh, is this a thing?
Yes.
Um, did you
Yeah,
know?
no, I was the same. I couldn't believe that like no one had ever really like dug into that stuff, and so weirdly, I kind of, I've like in the last couple of years, I've like, accidentally become like the Corpse Road guy, because I made a film that was all about Corpse Roads as well, which is like nothing to do with this novel. It was just sort of coincidence that I got commissioned to make a folk horror film, and the executive producer wanted something to do with ritual, and she mentioned Corpse Roads in the brief. And I was like, I know all about that. And
Yeah.
so I wrote something completely different that was also about Corpse Roads, but was much more of a kind of period thing where it goes much deeper into that mythology. So yeah, I think I've mined that subject pretty extensively now.
What a good coinkydink, though, that you just happened to. I just worked on this, so
Yes,
that's
it's
really
like here's
cool.
one I made earlier. Yeah.
um, so when you started out putting the story together, did you know how you were going to end it, or did that develop as you were going?
It's such a long time ago that I wrote the original story, but I imagine I did. I don't. Sometimes things come to me while I'm writing them, but I generally have an idea of where I'm going.
Mm-hmm.
And with this story, it's so intrinsic to what it's about that I can only imagine that I knew pretty early where it was going.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing about the script and the novel is that the script is much more from Annie's perspective,
Mm-hmm.
because it's more difficult to get that kind of dual narrator thing in a film, and
Mm-hmm.
so it was told more through her eyes. But so in the novel, very early on, I was like, oh no, it's completely natural to tell the novel sort of ping ponging between their perspectives, and in a way that sort of felt like it was a better way to tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of glad it ended up as a novel in a way, because it just sort of seemed like that was probably what it should have been all along. But
Yeah,
when I first wrote it as a script, I wasn't writing books, so that was before I ever thought of doing such a thing.
when did you branch into novels and short stories, Sean, from scripts?
So it was kind of by accident, really. I was approached, I think it was about 2016, so best part of 10 years ago. I was approached to write a monograph for PS Publishing, just out of the blue, um, by an editor who was starting a series of film monographs. And I'd never met him, but he just contacted me out of the blue and said, I wonder if you'd be interested in writing one of these. And I was like, sure, why the hell not? I never thought I'd write a novel. I thought I was just a screenwriter. I never thought I'd write prose, but I was like, oh, I'll write this book. And obviously it was meant to be non-fiction, but what I ended up doing was writing something that was partly fiction. Because I'd always had this idea for the book that eventually became England Screaming in my head, but I didn't really think I'd write it. So I kind of did a dry run for it in this monograph that I wrote on a British horror movie called Deathline from the 70s. And after that, the editors, and I mentioned the fact that I'd had this bigger book in my head, and the editor was like, well, if you ever write that book, I'll gladly publish it. And so eventually I was like, I could give that a go. And so I sat down and wrote England Screaming, which I think I probably would have started working on in late 2018. And I just had fun doing it. I didn't really know what I was doing, because I'd never set out to be a prose writer, and so I was sort of teaching myself as I went along. But and the book came out like just as lockdown started, and I kind of thought no one was ever going to read it. But it turned out that people were stuck at home with nothing better to do, and so quite a lot of people did read it. And so then it just sort of snowballed, and I started writing short stories, and wrote this immediately after England Screaming, but then went back and wrote the big beast that you showed at the beginning of the interview.
I was going to say, for somebody who didn't think that they were going to be a prose writer, this is quite a lot of prose. It must come naturally to you. Well, I think if you're a script writer, I just feel like it's like you kind of got storytelling down low, so I think it is transferable. I studied script writing, and that the year that I was studying that, it was the year that I started getting short stories published, because it really improved my prose writing, because I learned how to not be so overly wordy, because scripts are so different.
Yeah.
Yeah, I learned how to sort of like trim the fat out of my shorts then, and I think it made me a better writer in general, like learning those things. But do you have a preference, or are there things that you like about one medium more than the other in terms of storytelling?
I mean, yeah, there are obviously differences, and um, scripts are much more kind of, they are just sort of structure and dialogue, and that's it. But as you say, that's very good for sort of learning the rudiments of storytelling. You can apply that to writing prose. With prose, I still feel as though it's obviously not just the story you're telling, it's how you're telling it. It's, the prose in a way, it's like when you're making a film, thinking up the shots and how sequences work visually. The prose is doing that in a book, and you kind of have to train yourself to think like that. I'm like, how do I create this picture I've got in my head through prose? So, but they're both fun to do in their own way. I still feel like I've been making films for long enough now that I feel like I've got a decent handle on it. Whereas like prose fiction, I still feel like I'm learning every time I sit down and do it. I mean, the one thing I really like about prose fiction, which I'm sure anyone who's ever worked in film would agree, that no one is looking over your shoulder telling you what you can and can't do, and no one is going to, I'm not talking about editorial feedback because that's always useful, but no one is going to come in and change your novel or your short story, which has happened to me several times working in the film industry, as it happens to everyone. You are the boss of your own novel, which is not always the case in film. So I understand why screenwriters do make that leap, just because it can be, working in film can be absolutely soul destroying. And I've been lucky in as much as I've managed to make a bunch of, because they were sort of smaller budgeted independent films that are pretty much what I wanted them to be. But I've also had experiences where things have been ruined. Yeah,
because they both end up being like, because if you publish a book, it does end up being a collaborative process if you're going to work with a publisher and editors and things like that. But it's not not in the same ballpark as a screenplay, is it? I've heard one writer I know saying he is so sick of the phrase, "Oh, the writers messed that up." Because the industry's changed a lot in recent years as well. He said, that he worked on a TV script, and then he said they used to keep the writers like on as they were filming in case they wanted to change things, but they've changed it now so that they kind of just like in the writers' room and then they're gone. And he said like the changes that everyone was complaining about with this show, like the things that people were complaining about were changes that the writers didn't even make. And I thought, oh man, I'd be so devastated if my name was on something and then I realized they'd completely changed a thing and the audience hated it and then I'm getting blamed for it.
So. Yeah. I mean, I have films out there with my name on that some of them I haven't even watched because I just know they're going to be terrible, and others I have watched and just gone, oh. I had one film that I worked on that was supposedly going to be my reward for having helped save another film, which I came on and sort of script doctored, and which is a whole story in and of itself. And then the company were like, right, we're going to get you to write this new script as a thank you, as a reward for the work you've just done on this other film. And then they proceeded to let the director rewrite me and ruin it. And then when they went and made the film, they were like, oh, we wish we'd have made your script. And I'm like, well, you could have done. You just had to say no to the director.
Yeah, so I haven't had I've written a couple of theatre scripts, and the one of them was sort of independently produced by this like little fledgling theatre company, and they were like bits and pieces changed, but it was more like the actors had thought it was like a comedy horror thing, and the actors had kind of like thought of extra funny lines as they were going and like thrown them in. And I thought, oh, that's actually strengthened. That's made me look even funnier than I
am. I'm not saying that no one else could come up with a good idea or whatever.
Oh,
that's fine. But I mean, the thing I'm working on at the moment is quite heavily improvised. I wrote a script just so that everyone knew what it was, but because it's sort of kind of told in a mock documentary style, we want that sort of sense of naturalism. So I've basically sort of said to the actors, all right, the script is kind of like, that's your character, that's all the information you need, but you need to put this in your own words. And sometimes they come up with stuff where you're just sort of like, oh, I could never have written that. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So,
it can go either way though. Is like the more people who are involved that have a say, and everyone's got different tastes and opinions,
Yeah.
that's when things tend to go awry. Yeah, that play I wrote, it was like a 4-person cast and a director who was also doing all of the other work, so it was only a handful of people. But I feel like, yeah, if I'd developed that for the screen, I don't think it would have looked like it was actually made. I don't think it would have looked like the way I wrote it initially. But yes, completely different disciplines though, script and prose.
Yeah. No, as I say, I'm still figuring the whole prose thing out, but I'm enjoying doing it. So
Well, I think you did a pretty good job, Sean. I gotta say,
thank you.
and
I don't know. I still feel like a bit of an imposter because I'm sort of, this is still a relatively recent thing for me. So.
Well, I hate to break this to you, but the really experienced novelists that I've talked to that have been doing it for decades have told me that just doesn't go away. So.
Right. Well, yeah.
I think that's how you know that you're doing it right. That's the conclusion I've drawn from that. I know you've written. I know you've got a bunch of short stories. You've got, is it 2 books you've got for the Black Shuck Shadows?
Yes, they're also sort of tied in with the whole screaming thing. So they're very much a similar format, but they're just sort of very little compressed Shadows books. But yeah, I've been writing short stories as well. I had one come out in the book Unquiet Slumbers last year, which is by this new press, Nepenthe, who are doing these sort of lovely limited edition anthologies. So, and I actually sold a few short stories before Christmas, so I've got a bunch more coming this year. I've done a few for Nightmare Abbey, which is like this quarterly sort of short story publication. I sort of like, I enjoy doing them. I'm always happy to write one if someone offers me a chance to. I think because I started in script writing, I tend to think in longer stories. So writing novels feels quite natural to me because I'm used to thinking of longer stories. Short stories I sometimes struggle with a bit, and I'm like, I don't know if I have small ideas. I only have these ideas that want to be big.
I have the opposite problem. I can always sit down and write a short, but I get short, like there are short story ideas and then novel ideas. I feel I get a lot of short story ideas, and then when I try to write longer form, I feel like I have a novel idea, but I haven't quite got it's the middle section I struggle with because I'm excited about the beginning and the end.
It's the same with scripts though. It's always Act 2 is the difficult one.
Yeah.
It's like setting up the story is fine, the climax is fine. It's like what happens in between. It's like, yeah, that's what I'm dealing with at the moment. I'm actually sort of working on a new novel at the moment, and I'm kind of in the middle. And I'm like, oh yeah, I wonder if this is enough is happening here, or if it's happening in the right order, or all this kind of thing.
Well, I also have it on good authority that apparently all novelists feel that way too. Like they're excited about the beginning and the end, and then they're all a bit in doubt about the middle.
Yes. Yeah, when you're really lost in the weeds, and you're like, I don't know where I'm going, or what the right way to go is.
Yes, I am working on a novel right now. I did write one during lockdown, but it is not publishable, and I realised that a couple of months later. I went back and read it again, and I thought, what is this?
Not even with a firm editorial hand, you think?
No, it was like the 4th draft, and I thought, I just don't think that this is a good story, yeah, and I had people say to me, "Oh, you're being too hard. Just publish it." And I was like, "No, that will not be my debut novel."
Yes, I think that's a healthy attitude to have. You don't need to publish everything you write,
Yeah, maybe I'll revisit it and be able to do it a bit better when I'm a bit more experienced. But I thought, no, I'll just leave it for now and work on some other stuff. Do you have? So your approach to, like, obviously, I would assume sort of different approaches.
Yes, very much.
Yeah. So what was your kind of process with this beast? I have to know.
So, well, obviously before that, England Screaming was sort of like the smaller prototype for that. And, I knew what the style of the book was going to be because it was inspired, as I sort of said at the time, it was inspired by a book that was published in the 80s called Suspects. Oh, my camera's gone again.
I can still hear you, but we were worried about this, everyone, before we actually started recording.
I don't. Yeah, who knows? This is Skype for you. I don't know what to tell you.
Very sorry, everyone. Maybe it'll just come back, Sean.
Okay, all right. I'll just keep talking. Maybe it'll come back.
Okay.
So yeah, I knew what the format of the book was going to be, and for a while I thought maybe I should I had visions of putting a big piece of paper on the wall and sort of having this kind of map of all these different characters and how they would link up, and it just being a mass of sort of red lines and dotted lines linking everyone and how all the stories would interconnect. And I just kind of thought, that's insane. I'll spend a year just doing that before I write anything. So in the end, I just kind of sat down and let it happen organically, and it seemed to work. So when I started Twilight Star Screaming, which is obviously over twice the size of England Screaming, I was like, fuck it, I'm just going to write it, and spent the next year of my life wading through that book. And it was really just a case of, I had like a long list of films that I would definitely wanted to include, and then it was just a case of constantly watching stuff, making notes, and just things would come to me. Like sometimes I knew there were some stories that I was going to do, and then I would watch a film and something would occur to me, or I would just go, yeah, and that character there, they know that character, and that's how that's going to cross over. And that was really me kind of improvising on the hoof. I had an idea of where it was going to go, but because the structure of those books is a lot looser, I could just kind of see what happened. And it really after a year or so, I was like, I could write this book until the end of my life, but I think it's about time I wrapped it up now. So I was just kind of like, yeah, I think that's enough. I'm just going to guide it towards the finish line now.
Yes,
So
work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Corpse Road was kind of a much simpler process because I already had a map because the script existed, and it's, although there's more in the novel and there's things are more fleshed out, but the actual sort of progression of the plot and everything is pretty much the same as it was in the script. So that was actually quite relatively simple to do.
I just realized we didn't sort of conceptually tell people what this is.
Right. Yes. So yeah, the Twilight Star Screaming and England Screaming before it are essentially kind of big metafictional cinematic metafiction, I tend to call them. They basically take characters from horror movies and sort of related genre adjacent movies throughout the decades and weave them together in this sort of big shared universe of awfulness. And they are both kind of film criticism and fiction, and they're kind of a state of the world address, I guess you'd call them. There is a sort of they sort of use genre films as a lens to look at the world, and so they're very much, there's a lot in them about the state of things and politics and all this kind of stuff, which is still unfortunately proving to be very much the case as when I wrote them. That's what they are, if that makes any sense to anyone.
It's like, I haven't read anything else like them because there is like, metafiction and stuff, and then multiverse kind of setups and stuff, but I haven't read anything that's specifically like this that combines things like that so well and so uniquely. And I don't know if it's because your route into writing prose and novels was a little bit unconventional, maybe compared to, like, you know, someone that studies creative writing or something, and then they always know they want to go into writing novels. But yeah, it because it's like unconventional when you explain it for like what you would normally expect in a book. But that, I think that's why it works so well.
It's just I'd say I didn't really have any ambitions beyond those books when I started writing England Screaming,
Mm-hmm.
and they were just incredible fun to do because they enable me to write in different styles and different voices and sort of experiment a lot because although the structure is very much sort of like one character, one chapter, those chapters are told in loads of different ways, and in different styles. And so, as much as anything, those books really were me sort of like teaching myself to write because I could just try different things and see what worked best.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's why, you know, I still write one of those stories every month. I have a Patreon because
Mm-hmm.
you know, people would always ask, "Oh, when are you going to write another Screaming book?" And for various reasons, I'm not necessarily planning to do that. But I kind of thought I still like writing them, and
Mm-hmm.
so I write a story every month on Patreon for, you know, people who want to subscribe who like those books and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, just want to see that continue. And they're still fun to do because I just get to play around, and write in different voices. And you know, it's really it's really enjoyable to sort of take characters from films that I love who have these sort of distinctive voices. You have this actor in your head and you're writing new dialogue for them, and you know, getting
Mm-hmm.
to write as those people, which is just like really, really entertaining to do.
Yeah, it's entertaining to read too.
Glad.
um, yeah, it's they're just real. Oh, I was gonna say, sorry, I before I forget, I will put for anyone listening or watching, in the description, I will put links for all of Sean's stuff and their Patreon and everything, so you can check everything out. I always forget to say that right at the beginning, and you know, before we finish, I'll just say it now in case I forget to say it when we're signing off. But yeah, that sounds fun for your Patreon, Sean.
Yeah, no,
That's
it's good. It's good. I say I'll carry on doing it as long as I'm still having fun and as long as people still want to read it. But yeah.
Do you have whether it's like a script or a film or a book, do you have a favorite piece of your own work at the moment?
Oh God. I mean, it's always the most recent thing. So I guess the film. Well, we shot it a couple of years ago now, but it's only recently kind of properly come out into the world.
Mhm.
I made this film called To Fire You Come at Last, which is this period folk horror movie, which is now streaming on Shudder for anyone who has Shudder and hasn't seen it. Um, that was the first film I'd made in a while.
Mhm.
I actually got to the point where, I mean, like making films in this country is incredibly difficult, especially independent films. And I'd actually got to the point where I wasn't sure if I was ever going to make another film, and then that one kind of just happened accidentally.
Mhm.
And it was really nice to just. It was the hardest thing I've ever made in terms of the shoot because it was just we shot it in like a week, and it was all exteriors, and it was in March, and it was cold and wet and muddy, and we were like trying to get too much done in too little time, and it was
Mm.
just an absolutely insane shoot. So the fact that there's even a coherent film at the end of it is amazing to me because I wasn't sure that there would be. But I'm really fond of that film, just because I didn't think I'd ever get to do anything again, and I think we like pretty much pulled it off.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, that's good. Novel wise, yeah, I mean at the time I kind of thought Twilight's Last Screaming, I kind of thought that's everything I wanted to do with these books. I thought that I poured everything into that book. I
Mhm.
can't do any more than that.
Yeah.
So yeah. I still feel as though that's I have a certain sense of accomplishment about that book, just because, yeah. I thought it might for a while. I thought it was the book I would never finish. But also the Corpse Road, because that story's been in my head for so long, and because it is like rightly you say that it feels very personal. It is very personal in many ways, and it was because I tried to make it as a film, and then that never happened. And then even after I wrote the novel, I spent a couple of years trying to get it published, and kept being told no by sort of mainstream publishers or agents because it was too slow, it wasn't commercial enough, etc., etc., etc. So that it feels good that it's just out in the world. That there's a certain sense of finally it's done after all these years. So yeah, so I guess I'm proud of them all until I pick them up and look at them again, and then I'm like, oh my god, I could have done that so much better. But
do you know, I actually think when I was reading this, I was thinking, I hope that at some point somehow A24 gets hold of it.
Yes, A24, come and give me some money.
I think A24 make really good horror films, and
yes, I do.
Yeah, and
it's funny because then weirdly the kind of capper to that story is that after I wrote the novel and before I got it published, I was approached by someone I knew that had just started a production company, and they said, "Oh, we're looking for material, specifically female-driven material." And I was like, "This like novel I haven't published yet that might work." And so they were like, "Oh, we'd love to read it." So I sent it to them, and for a while they were developing it as a TV miniseries. I actually wrote the pilot episode for a miniseries version of that, and then that didn't happen. But it's kind of gone full circle now to sort of like film script, novel, miniseries. I don't know. Next, maybe it will be a musical stage play or something like that. That it just never seems to quite go away. That story.
Imagine that, dance routines and everything. Well, yeah, there's the phrase development hell. I've spoken to so many authors that had something optioned or something was in production, and the number of the percentage wise, the number of things that actually end up being made compared to the amount of things that are started or optioned is so small, isn't it? It's a miracle.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically just if you get some option money, just be grateful for that, because it's like at least it's a bit of extra cash. It doesn't mean the film's ever going to get made, but
yeah.
Money is always nice.
I don't know if I can't remember if this was just said to me outside of an author interview, so I won't say who it was, what the book was, but an author told me that they wrote a novelization for a film once, and then years later someone approached him and was like, "Oh, we'd like the rights to make a film." They were like, "Well, I hate to break it to you, but the film exists, and that's what the novel's based on. So, it's already out there." I just thought that was so strange. Quite well-known film also, so I was like,
really?
Oh, yeah, and it says the novelization on the book cover, so I just thought, I did wonder.
Industry people are not always the brightest.
So, just a funny story. If you were to recommend any of your work for someone to start with that maybe hasn't read or watched anything that you've
Sorry, my cat is now busting in the room. let me just let him in.
Yes, that's fine. You can't keep him out.
Right. Sorry about that.
Quite all right. Yeah, you can't keep a cat out. They'll just keep going.
Yes.
Yeah, I was asking you if for anyone who hasn't read or watched any of your work, where would you recommend as a good start?
I mean, I think fiction-wise, The Corpse Road is probably a good place to start, because the other books are very much. I think you have to have a certain interest in genre cinema to read them. You don't necessarily have to have seen every film. referenced in those books. That was never my intention, and like only, very, very geeky people will have seen everything referenced in the books. But they are very much their own thing. Whereas the Corpse Road, I think, if you enjoy, genre fiction, suspense fiction, I hope people would get something from that. So I think that's a good place to start fiction wise.
Yes.
Yeah, film wise, I mean, at the moment, not much of it is widely available because a lot of them have sort of fallen out of distribution. I've got one that's an older one I made called The Devil's Business, which should be coming back into distribution fairly soon. And a lot of people like that film. I know for some reason it's one that genre authors seem to like, probably because it's got lots of talking in it. But I know quite a few genre authors who really like that film, and that should be visible again, sort of in the not too distant future. But yeah, like I say, I mean, To Fire You Come at Last, that's the one that's most easily available at the moment, and it's that's very much in the kind of style of sort of classic TV ghost stories. The sort of ghost stories for Christmas were a real inspiration for that. So anyone who likes that kind of thing, who likes sort of like, spooky old kind of gothic horror storytelling, then I would recommend that one for sure.
Cool. Well, I know what's on my watch list for the weekend now.
yeah, it's on it was actually, it was commissioned as a separate thing entirely and now accidentally it kind of became the pilot for a whole series of kind of Christmas ghost stories that Shudder will be doing every year now. So on Shudder, it's underneath the banner of The Haunted Season because that is the series title, but it is the only one under that banner so far. They're making another one now, I think. But yeah, To Fire You Come at Last is the pilot for that new season.
Oh, I'm excited to go watch it.
Yes, I hope you enjoy it because it was hellish to make.
I love getting to watch things when I have a little bit of the background context.
Right, yes.
Well, I guess I should let you go now. We've been talking for nearly an hour, but sorry to everyone that we lost Sean's face. Maybe I can put a picture of you here in place, Sean, so that people can still gaze.
Put a picture of something far prettier than me, which is, that shouldn't be hard to find.
But no, picture of you and your books, I reckon. But thank you so much again for doing this. It's been so lovely to talk to you, and I'm sure you could tell how enthusiastic I am about this in particular. And yeah, it's been lovely to get to ask you questions and pick your brain a little bit about it.
Oh, it's been great. You were the first person to sort of like say anything publicly about that novel, so I'm more than happy to do it. It's been lovely talking to you about it because for a while I wondered if anyone was even reading it.
Oh well, I'm pretty confident. I just feel like horror fans have to get this, and usually when I recommend books, I say who I would recommend them to specifically, because not every book I read is something I would recommend just broadly to everybody. But yeah, anything that makes my top 10 and I feel really excited about, I would say everyone should just, have a little read, pick up The Corpse Road and be spooked like I was. It's a really good book.
Thank you.
Okay, before I continue to gush, I will let everybody go now. So yes, thank you again for doing this, Sean. I really appreciate it. And once again, the links for everything we've discussed will be in the description so that people can go off and find everything nice and easily. And our usual sign off, because we're goats, Sean, is bleed.